My name is Richard Vance. I am 54 years old, and for nearly 3 decades, my entire life revolved around the steady, exacting world of corporate compliance. I had spent 29 years buried beneath spreadsheets, environmental impact studies, and complex financial ledgers at Cascade Energy Systems in Portland, Oregon. My role was simple yet vital: ensure every project, every contract, and every emission metric strictly adhered to state and federal law. Over those 29 years, while executives came and went, I remained the quiet anchor of the auditing department. I took pride in my work because I truly believed that upholding the law protected both the company and the public we served. That wet Friday morning, Portland was draped in its familiar coat of gray fog, with a persistent drizzle tapping against the high glass windows of the executive tower. The atmosphere inside our office was unusually tense. Whispers floated across the cubicles, and the usual clatter of keyboards had slowed to a cautious hum. Toby Brooks, a promising young junior auditor whom I had mentored since his first week on the job, walked quietly up to my desk. His face was pale, and his fingers fidgeted nervously with a notepad. He hesitated before speaking in a hushed tone. He told me that Harrison Thorne, our newly appointed vice president of corporate operations, wanted to see me in his office immediately after lunch. Toby asked if everything was all right, his eyes filled with genuine concern. I looked up from my dual monitors and offered him a reassuring smile, though a cold knot was already forming in my stomach. I told him that after 29 years in internal compliance, one meeting with executive management was hardly cause for panic. Toby nodded uncertainly and retreated to his workstation. But as I stared back at the spreadsheets in front of me, I knew deep down that this meeting was not routine. The friction between Harrison Thorne and myself had been building for months, reaching a boiling point earlier that autumn. Harrison Thorne was 40 years old, charismatic, sharp, and fiercely ambitious. He had been brought in from a rival energy conglomerate, with a mandate to streamline operations and maximize quarterly profit margins. But Harrison viewed regulatory compliance not as a shield to protect the company, but as a minor speed bump to be bypassed whenever convenient. 3 months prior, Harrison had brought me the preliminary audit file for the Nevada Solar and Biomass Project, a vast clean energy initiative backed by tens of millions of dollars in federal subsidies. He needed my signature to certify that the project met strict federal environmental output criteria. When I analyzed the raw data, however, the numbers simply did not add up. The reported carbon offset figures were inflated by over 18%, and the operational emissions logs had been altered to hide non-compliant exhaust levels. When I refused to sign off on the fraudulent report, Harrison had walked into my office, closed the door, and leaned over my desk with a smile that failed to reach his eyes. He had warned me in no uncertain terms that everyone at Cascade Energy Systems understood the line of executive cooperation, and that stubborn perfectionism would only destroy my own career. I had stood my ground, documenting every discrepancy and submitting an internal notice of non-compliance. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, my desk phone rang. Harrison Thorne's executive secretary informed me with dry formality that the vice president was waiting. I stood up, straightened my suit jacket, and smoothed my necktie. As I walked past Toby's desk, he watched me with anxious eyes. I gave him a slight nod to let him know I was fine, but inside, a chilly wind seemed to sweep through my chest. The elevator carried me up to the 16th floor, where the carpet was plush and the walls were lined with polished mahogany. When I entered Harrison Thorne's corner office, he was sitting behind a massive glass desk, staring out at the rain-blurred skyline of downtown Portland. He did not immediately look up. On the polished glass surface sat a sleek leather folder with my name printed on the tab. When Harrison finally turned to face me, his expression was entirely devoid of warmth. He motioned for me to sit down, his tone smooth and detached. He began by talking about economic headwinds, corporate restructuring, and the strategic mandate from the board of directors to reduce overhead expenses. He explained that as part of this sweeping reorganization, my position as senior compliance officer was being eliminated immediately. I sat perfectly still, staring into his cold eyes. I asked him directly if he was terminating my employment 4 days before my full 29-year retirement. pension was scheduled to vest, Harrison did not flinch. He responded with practiced indifference, claiming that the timing was purely coincidental and strictly governed by corporate restructuring timelines. He slid the leather folder across the desk, instructing me to sign the severance agreement, which included an immediate non-disclosure clause and a total waiver of legal claims against the company. I knew immediately that his actions violated federal labor regulations. Under the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, commonly known as the Warren Act under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, a major employer is legally required to provide at least 60 days advance written notice before executing mass layoffs or structural position eliminations. Furthermore, executing a targeted termination days before pension vesting to evade retirement obligations constituted a blatant breach of fiduciary duty and intentional interference with employee benefits. Instead of begging, arguing, or showing anger, I looked at the severance document, pushed it back toward him unsigned, and stood up. I told him calmly that I would not be signing any non-disclosure agreements today. Harrison frowned, surprised by my composure. He had clearly expected tears, anger, or desperate bargaining. I adjusted my cuffs, shook his cold hand, and turned toward the door. When I descended to my floor, familiar faces quickly averted their eyes. In the corporate world, sudden termination is treated like a contagious disease. No one wants to stand too close to the person being escorted out. I packed my belongings in quiet dignity into a single cardboard box. I packed a small potted desk plant, a framed plaque honoring my 25 years of faithful service, and a framed photograph of my late wife, Sarah, who had passed away 8 years ago. Sarah had always been my moral compass, reminding me that integrity is doing what is right even when nobody is watching. Toby Brooks stood by the edge of my cubicle, tears welling in his eyes. He whispered how deeply sorry he was and how unfair this was. I placed a steady hand on his shoulder and advised him to stay focused on his work, but reminded him never to compromise his principles for the sake of a paycheck. I carried my box through the glass doors and out into the biting Portland rain. The cold wind whipped against my coat as I stood on the sidewalk, looking back up at the towering glass building where I had dedicated 29 years of my life. My clothes were soaked, but my mind was completely crystal clear. Harrison Thorne believed he had executed a flawless corporate execution. He believed that taking my job and threatening my pension would force me into quiet defeat. What Harrison Thorne did not realize was that over 29 years in corporate audit, I had learned how the machinery operated. I stepped toward my car, turned back to the towering building, and whispered into the rain that if they wanted to see how a career ended, I would show them what true accountability looked like. The drive back to my home on the edge of Forest Park was quiet and solemn. The rain continued to fall in heavy rhythmic sheets, washing over the windshield as the streetlights began to flicker on across the damp city. My small house, nestled among the tall Douglas firs, had been my sanctuary ever since Sarah passed away 8 years ago. Stepping inside, the familiar scent of old books and cedar brought a fleeting sense of comfort, but the silence felt heavier than usual. I set the cardboard box containing my 29 years of office doll's memories onto the dining table. I took off my wet coat, hung it by the door, and went into my study. In the back corner of the room, hidden beneath a floorboard inside my built-in oak bookshelf, sat a heavy, fireproof steel safe. I knelt down, entered the 7-digit combination, and turned the heavy dial until the lock disengaged with a sharp metallic clack. Inside the safe lay 3 years of meticulous documentation. I had never intended to use these records for personal vengeance. Throughout my career, I believed that an auditor's duty was to preserve the truth, regardless of corporate politics. But 3 years ago, when Harrison Thorne joined Cascade Energy Systems and began reshaping our compliance policies, I recognized the dangerous trajectory the company was taking. I pulled out a series of color-coded folders, external hard drives, and digital audio tapes. Among the files was the complete unedited raw data from the Nevada Solar and Biomass project from the previous summer. The internal reports clearly showed an intentional deviation of 18% between actual environmental emissions and the figures submitted to federal oversight committees. Next to the paper files was a digital recording device containing audio from an internal executive file committee meeting held 10 months ago. I connected the audio player to my desktop speakers and hit play. Harrison Thorne's voice filled the quiet study, clear, arrogant, and smooth. On the recording, Harrison could be heard explicitly instructing the senior engineering staff to manipulate the carbon offset metrics. He had told them that federal regulatory agencies only cared about seeing polished, favorable reports, and that no one in Washington would ever come to Oregon to audit raw sensor logs. When an engineer raised concerns about legal exposure, Harrison dismissed the warning, stating that compliance was merely an artistic exercise in presentation. Listening to his words again, a cold determination took root in my soul. Harrison had committed a direct breach of fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders, violated federal environmental statutes, and committed corporate fraud under Sarbanes-Oxley compliance mandates. By firing me to suppress this evidence, he had also committed severe retaliation against an internal compliance officer. I sat at my desk for hours organizing the evidence chronologically. I cross-referenced the altered emission spreadsheets with internal emails, meeting minutes, and financial transfers. The data revealed a systematic pattern of deception designed to inflate Cascade Energy's valuation prior to a major federal grant application worth tens of millions of dollars. At 8 o'clock the following morning, a crisp Saturday, I decided it was time to reach out to the one person in federal regulatory oversight whom I trusted completely. Her name was Catherine Ross, a senior special inspector with the United States Department of Energy and former member of the Securities and Exchange Commission Regulatory Task Force. Catherine and I had served together on a regional compliance panel 12 years ago, and I knew her to be a woman of uncompromising ethics. I dialed her office number, expecting to leave a voicemail. To my surprise, she answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was sharp, professional, and instantly recognizable. When I identified myself as Richard Vance, her tone softened with warm familiarity. She asked how things were at Cascade Energy, noting that she had not heard from me in quite some time. I took a deep breath and told her plainly that I had been terminated from my position the previous afternoon, exactly 4 days before my full pension was set to vest. The phone line went completely silent for several seconds. Catherine then asked in a low, measured voice if my termination was connected to the Nevada Clean Energy audit files. I confirmed that it was, adding that I possessed comprehensive, unedited hard evidence demonstrating systematic falsification of federal reports, internal forgery, and executive misconduct. Catherine exhaled slowly over the line. She warned me that if the evidence I held was as extensive as I claimed, this was no longer a simple labor dispute or internal corporate squabble. It was a major federal criminal investigation. She cautioned that once formal disclosures were made, Harrison Thorne and Cascade Energy's legal team would deploy every resource at their disposal to discredit, threaten, and isolate me. She asked if I was fully prepared to face the storm that was coming. I looked over at the small framed photograph of Sarah resting on my desk. I told Catherine that I had already lost my career and my pension, but I refused to let them steal my honor or the truth. Catherine instructed me to meet her at 9 o'clock sharp on Monday morning at the Federal Building in downtown Portland, and stressed that I must keep all documents entirely secure and speak to no one in the interim. After ending the call, I spent the remainder of the weekend making duplicate encrypted backups of every hard drive and placing the original physical documents into a heavy-duty locked aluminum briefcase. On Sunday evening, I called my daughter, Elizabeth, who worked as an emergency room physician in Seattle. Hearing her sweet voice over the phone brought warmth to my weary heart. I refrained from telling her the stressful details of my termination or the upcoming federal meeting, wanting to protect her from any unnecessary anxiety. We talked about her work, her upcoming visit to Portland, and she reminded me to take care of my health. Hanging up the receiver, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The path ahead would be treacherous, but I was no longer acting out of fear. I was acting out of duty. On Monday morning, the sky over Portland remained a dark slate gray, casting a cold drizzle over the downtown avenues as I drove toward the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt Federal Building. The streets were filled with morning commuters rushing to their offices, umbrellas raised against the rain. I parked in the underground garage, retrieved the locked aluminum briefcase from my trunk, and took the elevator up to the main security checkpoint. After passing through magnetometers and presenting my credentials, I was escorted to the 10th floor where the Department of Energy's Office of Inspector General maintained its regional headquarters. Catherine Ross was waiting for me in the lobby. She looked dignified and sharp in a dark navy suit, her gray-streaked hair pulled back neatly. She greeted me with a firm hand grasp and led me straight into a high-security conference room. Inside the room were two other officials. George Palmer, a veteran federal financial auditor with decades of forensic accounting experience, and Diane Foster, a senior legal analyst for the Department of Justice. After introductions were made, I placed the briefcase onto the center of the conference table, unlocked the twin latches, and opened it. For the next 3 hours, we walked through the evidence step by step. I presented the raw emissions data logs alongside the altered final reports submitted to federal agencies. I demonstrated how Harrison Thorne had systematically manipulated key performance indicators to comply with federal funding prerequisites. George Palmer examined the financial spreadsheets with an expert eye, his expression growing increasingly stern as he traced the deliberate accounting irregularities. When I played the audio recording of Harrison's explicitly ordering the technical team to adjust the carbon metrics, Diane Foster leaned forward, taking detailed notes. She noted that Harrison's instructions constituted direct evidence of willful corporate fraud, wire fraud, and violations of Section 806 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which specifically prohibits retaliation against corporate whistleblowers who report regulatory infractions. By noon, the federal officials had reviewed the core evidence. George Palmer looked across the table at me and stated plainly that the documentation was among the most thorough and impeccably organized whistleblower filings he had seen in his 30-year career. Catherine Ross informed me that based on this submission, the Department of Justice and the Department of Energy would immediately initiate a formal joint federal investigation into Cascade Energy Systems. However, Catherine warned that corporate defense strategy usually moved swiftly when threatened. Less than 2 hours after I left the federal building, my suspicions were confirmed. As I sat in a quiet coffee shop near the waterfront, my cell phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. Harrison Thorne and Cascade Energy's corporate communications department had launched a preemptive public relations strike. A formal press release had been issued to major financial news outlets and local newspapers across the Pacific Northwest. The company publicly announced that Senior Compliance Officer Richard Vance had been terminated for gross professional misconduct, unauthorized exfiltration of proprietary corporate data, and severe ethics violations. The article painted me as a disgruntled, rogue employee who was attempting to blackmail executive management after being caught violating internal cybersecurity protocols. Shortly after the press release went live, 2 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by Agent Miller, arrived at my residence with an inquiry regarding the corporate data theft allegations filed by Cascade Energy. I received them calmly in my living room, provided them with the official federal whistleblower receipt issued by Catherine Ross earlier that morning, and demonstrated that every file in my possession was maintained strictly for regulatory disclosure under federal protection laws. The agents reviewed the documentation, noted my full cooperation, and departed satisfied that the corporate theft allegations were merely a retaliatory maneuver. Later that evening, as rain beat against my living room windows, I received an encrypted email from an unfamiliar address. Opening the attached file, I realized it was from Toby Brooks. Risking his own position at the company, Toby had managed to access an archived secondary server that Harrison Thorne had overlooked. Attached was a series of internal system administration logs, proving that Harrison had personally instructed the IT director to purge raw emissions databases 2 days prior to my firing. Toby's courageous act provided the missing digital link, proof of intentional destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice. I immediately forwarded the server logs to Catherine Ross and Diane Foster at the Department of Justice. As I turned off my computer that night, I realized that Harrison Thorne's arrogant attempt to destroy my reputation had backfired completely. The net was closing in, and the truth was gaining unstoppable momentum. By Wednesday afternoon, the joint federal investigation had accelerated at a breathtaking pace. Forensic data specialists from the Department of Justice had spent 48 hours dissecting the digital server logs provided by Toby Brooks and comparing them with the physical documents I had surrendered. What they uncovered went far beyond simple administrative misconduct or creative accounting. Catherine Ross called me into the federal building for an urgent update. Inside the conference room, legal analyst Diane Foster displayed a high-resolution projection of an executive sign-off document dated from 2019 on the wall screen. It was an official regulatory certification that had allowed Cascade Energy Systems to secure a $50 million federal clean energy grant. Diane pointed out a crucial detail on the signature line. Forensic handwriting and digital metadata analysts had definitively proven that my official digital signature had been copied, altered, and forged onto the 2019 compliance document without my knowledge or consent. Harrison Thorne had utilized forged regulatory approvals to satisfy federal grant prerequisites, committing felony forgery, fraud under federal contracting statutes, and severe violations under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, regarding unauthorized reproduction and manipulation of protected compliance documentation. The discovery of blatant forgery transformed the case from a regulatory audit dispute into an undeniable criminal prosecution. Federal prosecutors immediately secured sealed arrest warrants for Harrison Thorne and two complicit executive board members. Late Thursday evening, as a ferocious winter storm battered the Oregon coastline and poured heavy rain over Portland, Catherine Ross contacted me on my secure mobile line. Federal surveillance teams monitoring Harrison Thorne had just reported suspicious activity. Harrison had abruptly cleared out his executive office, transferred millions of dollars into offshore holding accounts, and instructed his private chauffeur to drive him to a secluded private hangar at Portland International Airport. He had booked an unscheduled charter flight to a non-extradition foreign jurisdiction, intending to flee the country before the sealed indictments could be unsealed the following morning. Catherine asked if I wanted to accompany the federal team to the airport terminal to assist in verifying the seized physical ledgers Harrison was attempting to take with him. Without a moment's hesitation, I put on my coat and joined Catherine and a team of armed FBI agents in an unmarked federal vehicle. We sped through the rain-drenched highways of Portland, red and blue emergency lights flashing through the darkness. When we arrived at the private aviation sector of Portland International Airport, the storm was at its peak. Wind howled across the tarmac and heavy rain lashed against the sleek exterior of a private Gulfstream jet idling near the hangar. Inside the well-lit terminal lobby, Harrison Thorne stood near the glass doors, wearing a dark trench coat and holding a heavy leather briefcase filled with sensitive financial documents and bearer bonds. Beside him stood his corporate legal counsel and two private security guards. When the glass doors slid open and I stepped into the lobby alongside Catherine Ross and four uniformed FBI agents, Harrison turned around. For a brief second, shock flashed across his face, but he quickly recovered his arrogant composure. Offering a cold, condescending smirk, Harrison looked directly at me and sneered that I was wasting my time. He boasted that his legal team would tie up any federal regulatory claims in administrative appeals for years, and that corporate executives of his standing always reached out of court settlements without ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. He looked at me with disdain, claiming that a ruined auditor with a revoked pension had no leverage against corporate power. I stood tall, looked him dead in the eye, and told him calmly that his era of impunity had come to an end. I informed him that we were not here for an administrative hearing. We were here to execute a federal criminal arrest warrant for securities fraud, forgery, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Before Harrison could respond, Agent Miller stepped forward, produced the signed warrant, and ordered Harrison to drop his briefcase and put his hands behind his back. Harrison's lawyer attempted to interject, but Diane Foster immediately presented the federal court order, freezing all corporate and personal offshore assets associated with Harrison Thorne. As the steel handcuffs clicked tightly around Harrison's wrists, his confident facade completely shattered. His face went pale as sheet, his arrogant smirk vanished, and his eyes filled with genuine panic. He stared at me in disbelief as the agents led him away through the rain toward a waiting police transport vehicle. As he passed me, I reminded him quietly that while money could buy influence, it could never erase the truth preserved in the data. 3 months after that stormy night at Portland International Airport, the final embers of the scandal at Cascade Energy Systems were officially settled in federal court. The evidence compiled over 3 years had proved entirely unassailable. Facing an overwhelming mountain of forensic accounting proof, digital metadata logs, and taped admissions, Harrison Thorne entered a guilty plea to federal charges of corporate securities fraud, felony forgery, environmental record falsification, and obstruction of justice. The federal judge sentenced Harrison Thorne to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Furthermore, 2 complicit members of Cascade Energy's board of directors were heavily fined, stripped of their corporate credentials, and permanently barred from ever serving as officers or directors of any publicly traded corporation in the United States. Cascade Energy Systems was forced to undergo a total corporate restructuring under the strict supervision of a court-appointed federal monitor. As part of the formal judicial resolution, the court ruled that my sudden termination 4 days prior to my pension vesting was a malicious, illegal act of corporate retaliation. The federal monitor immediately reinstated my full 29-year retirement pension, retroactively calculating all back pay and benefits owed to me. In addition, under the statutory provisions of the Securities and Exchange Commission Whistleblower Protection Act, I was awarded a 15% whistleblower bounty from the financial penalties recovered from Cascade Energy Systems. The award amounted to a substantial sum, far exceeding anything I had ever earned during my career. Yet, when the financial settlement was finalized, I felt no desire for personal luxury or ostentatious spending. I moved from my old suburban house to a quiet, light-filled home on the shores of Lake Oswego, where the morning sun reflected off the calm, clear water and the air was filled with the song of birds. I utilized a major portion of the Whistleblower Award to establish the Sarah Vance Memorial Foundation for Corporate Ethics and Integrity, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing full university scholarships to promising young students studying accounting, law, and corporate compliance. The foundation's primary goal was to encourage future professionals to stand firm against corporate corruption and uphold the highest standards of truth. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I sat on my front porch sipping warm tea and watching the golden leaves drift gently onto the lawn, a familiar blue sedan pulled into the driveway. Toby Brooks stepped out of the vehicle, wearing a sharp new suit and holding a leather briefcase. Following the corporate restructuring at Cascade Energy Systems, Toby had been promoted to lead the internal compliance department. He walked up the porch steps with a bright, confident smile and presented me with the very first annual compliance audit report completed under the new federal guidelines. We sat together for hours discussing corporate governance, ethics, and the bright future of his career. Seeing Toby carry the torch of integrity was the greatest reward I could ever receive. That evening, after Toby departed, I walked down to the edge of the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shades of amber and violet across the sky. I pulled a small silver locket from my pocket containing Sarah's picture and held it gently in my hand. I thought back to the wet Friday afternoon when I had walked out of the executive tower carrying my belongings in a cardboard box, disgraced and fired. In that moment of darkness, it would have been easy to feel defeated, to accept the injustice, and to slip into bitter silence. But by standing up for what was right, by trusting in the law and preserving the truth, justice had ultimately prevailed. I closed the locket, slipped it back into my pocket, and took a deep, peaceful breath of the cool evening air. The long war was finally over. I had lost my job, but I had reclaimed my honor, protected my community, and left a legacy of unyielding truth for generations to come.